Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming in. If you're joining us, please make sure that you are on mute so that we don't get any feedback. Thank you for dealing with us as we were sorting out some technical difficulties before we could get started, but now we are getting ready to. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to today's webinar from the Ecological Landscaping Alliance, Native Plant Communities for Midwest Urban Gardens, presented today by Angela Bowman. Before we introduce Angela, a few housekeeping items. Number one, this Saturday, September 23rd, is the Eco Tour at Greenwood Cemetery in New York. Number two, sign up for our new monthly bulletin. Use the link in chat to subscribe to the email list today. And then third, finally, Season's End Summit is fast approaching. Register today or as soon as possible for this amazing event on Thursday, October 26th. For more details and to sign up for the events, check out the events calendar at ecolandscaping.org. Also, if everybody would please stick around after the webinar to access the evaluation. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to ELA's newest staff member, Catherine Ward, to introduce today's speaker. Catherine?
Hello, everyone. So today our speaker is Angela Bowman, and Bowman generates green spaces that not only look beautiful, but also provide sanctuary and bring us closer to nature. By designing and planting with ecological processes in mind, we can unleash the power of gardens to restore lost animal habitat, manage stormwater, regenerate damaged soil, and improve climate resilience. Bowman Gardens offer design, installation, project management, and stewardship services, as well as garden coaching and consultating. Angela Bowman hails from Chicago, and now I'm going to turn the floor over to Angela.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Bowman. I have a small garden design business in Chicago. It's called Bowman Gardens. I've been a member of the ELA for a few years. I have really learned a lot from the great ELA webinars and other programming, and so I'm really pleased to be here and share some of my experiences with you today. Just a quick overview of what we'll be covering. We'll review quickly why we garden with native plants in the first place. I'm going to talk about some Midwestern regional inspiration from grasslands to woodlands. We'll talk about the difference between a garden and nature, and then some of the particular qualities of an urban garden. We'll talk about naturalistic planting design, which is really a great path towards invoking naturalistic plant communities. And then I'm going to share with you a couple of plant lists of plants that, in my experience, native plants that tend to work well in Chicago gardens, and I'm guessing probably a lot of other Midwestern urban gardens. And if you're from outside the Midwest, I think we know that many plants that are native to the Midwest are also native to the to the eastern part of the country. And I think a lot of these lessons will apply to urban gardeners really anywhere. So I know I'm really preaching to the choir here, but we'll just review some of the reasons that we garden with native plants. First of all, they are very beautiful. Whoops, what is going on there? They provide valuable habitat support. They bolster our climate resilience through carbon sequestration and also helping to manage stormwater, among other things. When we plant the plants that grow in our region, we know that they're suitable to some of these local conditions, and they really enforce our sense of place. I think in a conversation like this, it's worth considering the 4 landscape goals promoted by Doug Tallamy, our great ambassador of conservation-minded gardening. 1, a landscape can and should support a diverse community of pollinators throughout the growing season. 2, it should provide energy for the local food web. 3, it can help us manage the watershed. And 4, it can remove carbon from the atmosphere. There are, of course, many types of ecosystems here in the Midwest, but I'd say the archetypal communities that really inspire us are prairies, savannas, and woodland. That is their natural order of succession. It's worth noting that in this part of the world, every grassland will eventually become forested without intervention, chiefly fire, which was used extensively and deliberately by indigenous people for thousands of years. Fire was an essential element of land management and played a critical role in shaping communities, including the rate of forest succession on grasslands. Oops. Okay, a prairie. We all know what a prairie looks like. It is, of course, generally characterized by a dense mixture of grasses, forbs, and smaller woody plants. It is sunny. It is wide open. It is very exposed. 200 years ago, prairie covered 60% of Illinois, and only 1% of that prairie remains. Here in Illinois, the oak savanna is really our archetypal ecosystem, characterized by an open woodland of oak trees surrounded by grasses and forbs. Along the ground plane, you will find prairie plants, but also an increasing number of woodland edge plants. The purple coneflower, which we tend to think of as a prairie plant, is actually really native to these disturbed edge ecosystems. Oops. A woodland, of course, is characterized by a full canopy punctuated by occasional sunny opening with a ground plane consisting largely of shade plants, of course. These plants are more likely to flower in the spring and fall, unlike prairies, which are really at their showiest in middle of summer. Woodland flowers, on the whole, also tend to have less vivid colors than prairie plants. Okay, so are we really planting a prairie in our backyard? Are we really recreating a forest? No, we're not doing that. We're planting gardens. A garden is very different from a natural area. It's intentionally planted from scratch. It has far less biodiversity than natural plant communities, has different hydrology, soil profiles, etc. But they do, I think people tend to evoke and even idealize nature in gardens. And in naturalistic or conservation-minded garden design, we try to get closer to the spirit and the function of these natural plant communities. But again, a garden is not the same as an ecological restoration. Gardens are not only for nature, they are for us. They provide us with beauty, privacy, food. It's a place to hang out. They can help us manage stormwater. And this is great. These are really, really important for us. And I think part of my motivation as a garden designer is to use gardens to help people become familiar with native plant communities in an accessible way, and thereby come to love them, because we won't protect what we don't love. Relative to prairies and woodlands, urban gardens are truly tiny. The sunlight patterns are often shaped by buildings rather than trees, and the water movement is managed well or managed badly by massive infrastructure. Our soils have been altered by decades of construction, pollution, and garden amendments, soil amendments. When we plant a pocket prairie, we have to acknowledge that it's not going to function anything like a prairie, but we can evoke the prairie, and we can emulate some of these plant communities and the processes that govern them. And in doing that, we can not only beautify our surroundings, but we can provide critical habitat and forage for wildlife and create this sense of place that I think is so important to living in any community. Okay, so not every native plant is well suited to an urban garden. I'm sure you have all realized this already. For one thing, a lot of them are just way too big to even fit, or they're way too aggressive to be manageable on a small scale. So where in a bigger landscape, your biggest unit of planting might be a shade tree or even a stand of shade trees. In an urban garden, the biggest element might be just a small flowering tree or a shrub. For a really small site, you might have nothing bigger than a little mix of 3-foot perennials and foot-high grasses or sedges. So we just take that grand scale and we bring it down a few notches. These sites are small, but they're still worth doing with native plant communities in mind. Another big difference between a garden and a natural area, is legibility. There are some really interesting studies that are done about people's perception of native plant gardens. And it seems to be often true that if people cannot tell the difference between one species and the next species, it just looks way too wild and chaotic to them. While my personal taste may range more toward the wild than, say, a really formal garden, I want my designs to be aesthetically appealing and accessible to a wide audience. The last thing I want to do is perpetuate the idea that native plant gardens are just a weedy mess. Just a little note about straight species, the wild version of a plant versus cultivars. So all things being equal, I am generally going to shoot for the straight species rather than a cultivar for really 2 reasons. One is I don't want to interfere with an insect's ability to recognize a plant that it depends on. When you change things like flower and leaf color, that is a risk. Also, I want to support nurseries that are continuing to propagate the wild seed pool, the wild seed gene pool, so that it can continue to evolve, especially in the face of a changing climate. However, if we urban gardeners did not have access to smaller cultivars, especially of woody plants, we would have a very short list of shrubs to choose from. I mean, very often I don't have more than 3 to 5 feet of space to put a shrub, and there really are not that many woody plants that naturally stay that small. So I want the variety and benefits of those native shrubs. So I'm grateful for the dwarf cultivars. And it's also worth noting that certain grasses would really take over a carefully designed garden if they hadn't been bred for reduced seed production. So plant breeding does play, I would say, an important role in the urban native garden. Okay, so first I want to give credit here for this graphic to Claudia West and Thomas Rainier. This comes from their excellent book, Planting in a Post-Wild World. The concept of a matrix planting is really a schematic for how to emulate a natural plant community. And that is really a lot of what that book is about. And many other people have also written on this topic. I'd say the most important feature of a matrix planting is density. The goal is for the plants to grow together to cover the soil in a few years. Plants that live together then create a green mulch that is healthier and does a better job of weed suppression than wood chip mulch, which is really not that good for perennials. The other feature of a matrix is a series of layers that support each other, each one filling its physical and ecological niche. You've got your structure plants, which can range from a shade tree to a large perennial, depending on the scale of your garden. Your seasonal interest plants, usually perennials, those whose flower or shape changes with the season, and we tend to identify that season with, say, the coneflower really tells us summertime, or asters really say this is fall. And then the third layer is ground covers. Primarily grasses and sedges, but not limited to them. These are what create the matrix, this dense carpet that knits all the other plants together. And of course, when creating any garden, we want to consider plant growth rate, habit, and sociability, as well as its role in succession. So, you don't want to plant a rapidly spreading aggressive plant next to something that is very slow to establish. And if you understand that a pioneer species like columbine is going to seed readily on open soil, but is never going to take over, well, that's something that you can take advantage of. Okay, so I have compiled a couple of lists of plants that, in my experience, tend to do well in a range of Chicago residential gardens, which might have a range of sunlight and moisture, but they tend to be confined by buildings and concrete, and they lean towards clay and slightly alkaline soils. And I'm thinking there's probably similar conditions in many Midwestern cities. And of course, as we mentioned, a lot of these plants are also native to the eastern part of the country and some to the western part of the country. For the purpose of this discussion, I've broken this into sun-loving and shade-loving plants, which broadly speaking correspond to the prairie and savanna, and then to the woodland and edges. But like the grasslands and the woodlands themselves, these categories have very porous borders, so take that separation with a grain of salt. More importantly, I have grouped these plants according to the layers. Are they structural, seasonal, beam, or ground covering plants? Of course, these designations are also relative. There's a lot of plants that can serve one or more roles depending on the site, but I think it's a useful place to start. Also, just a note, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the wildlife benefits of most of these plants, but ahead of time, I'm just going to say all of these plants have great wildlife benefits. They're providing food or habitat for insects, birds, mammals, underground critters. This is a big reason for using them. But for the purpose of this, so we can just kind of assume that for all these plants, but for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to focus a little bit more on how the plants behave in this kind of urban setting. Okay, some sun-loving plants for open spaces. As I mentioned, a lot of prairie plants are just way too big and rambunctious for city gardens. So I'm going to talk about a subset of smaller plants that are a little less likely to run away from you and that you can see over. A lot of these plants are really tough. They can tolerate a lot of heat, wind, sunlight, drought, which actually makes them very well suited to neglected sites like parkways. It's a good to keep in mind that a lot of garden soils have been amended over time to become a lot richer than the lean prairie soils where these plants evolved. So in a really rich soil, they might get bigger or floppier. It's just something to keep in mind, a real difference between our gardens and some of these natural space soils. Okay, structure plants. Not a lot of trees are small enough for the tiny front and backyards that I work in, but a serviceberry will usually do the trick. As far as I'm concerned, this is nearly a perfect plant. It has multiple seasons of interest. It has a graceful shape. The berries are truly delicious, and of course, it's great for wildlife. Elderberry, another small tree, could be considered a large shrub, grows basically anywhere. It's not the tidiest plant. Depending on the setting, it can look a little bit wild, and it's definitely suckering, but it can be cut back regularly. It grows really fast. You can cut it all the way down to the ground in March, and it's still going to bloom later in the summer. It's nice that this is a tree that has, summer blooms. That's a little bit unusual. And of course, elderberries have great medicinal, culinary, and cocktail value. A chokeberry, I would say, for me, is the #1 most valuable native shrub that I work with. It's not too big, 4 to 6 feet high, 3 to 6 feet wide. It's got beautiful flowers in the spring. It's got beautiful color in the fall. It has these berries that persist through quite a bit of the winter time, makes them really interesting. There's also a red chokeberry whose berries are red. This berry is a superfood, very, very high in antioxidants. It is aptly named. It's very tannic. It's a little hard to swallow sometimes, but you can cook it with enough sugar and acid. You can mix it with other berries, and it can make really nice jams or compotes. There are various cultivars of aronia that come in even smaller sizes. Okay, so now we're getting into perennials. I mean, this is kind of a sub-shrub, Baptisia, right? And of the species of Baptisia, I would say this is the most stately, kind of makes a really great statement and presence in the garden. It does retain its shape over the winter, so you have nice winter interest. And it really does give a lot of shape to the garden. And of course, it has these beautiful leaves. And this is getting away from me here. And these deep blue flower spikes. Amsonia. I mean, this is truly an herbaceous plant. No one would really call it a subshrub, but I will say that a mature stand of Amsonia also has a nice big presence in the garden. The flowers are beautiful, but the bloom time is kind of brief. But even after the flowers are gone, a nice stand of Amsonia really gives a lot of shape to the garden. And then, of course, it has lovely yellow color in the fall. Okay, now we're going to talk about some seasonal interest plants for sunny spaces. Prairie smoke. These are now in like seasonal blooming order. I mean, this is one of the most adorable plants that I know. These crazy little flowers and fruit capsules, they look like nothing else. The seed head, of course, gives rise to the name. And then after the flowers are gone, we still have this mat-like foliage, which continues to serve as a great ground cover. And it has a beautiful reddish fall color. And this is a kind of plant that really gives you, really gives you a strong sense of place and regional identity. Another one is shooting star. Also blooms in the spring. Really, you can find it in woodlands or in prairies. It is an ephemeral. The leaves will go dormant in the summertime. So don't expect it to be covering the ground for you at other times. This is another plant is so unusual. I think it's a great ambassador plant. People will stop. You plant it along the edge of the garden. They're going to ask you about it. I have a friend whose neighbors were for years skeptical of her native plant garden, and it was really the shooting star that won them over. Okay, penstemon. This is really the face of late spring. This tells us that summer is on the way. I think that its white flowers are really important. I mean, I know we're drawn to a lot of color, but white flowers really gives your eye a little bit of a rest. This is 2 to 3 feet high. It doesn't take up too much space, kind of colonizes nicely, reseeds gently, but not aggressively, and really mixes well with other plants. Like, for example, Coreopsis. There are many species of Coreopsis. This one has basal leaves. This can do well in very dry or medium soil. This also reseeds quite a lot, and this one I would say is pretty aggressive, so you might want to keep an eye on it. But I mean, this cheerful yellow flower, totally iconic prairie flower, and is just a magnet for caterpillars and native bees. I assume that you're all familiar with the concept of a keystone plant, but I'll just briefly say these are plants that support an unusually high number of other organisms or interactions. So they have really a central role, and Coreopsis as a genus is a keystone plant. Milkweed, also, of course, we know about milkweed as the host plant for our beloved endangered monarch butterflies. I would say that swamp milkweed is much better behaved in a garden than a common milkweed, which is really big, can kind of flop over a lot, reseeds really aggressively. This is a little bit better behaved. The flower color is a little more intense. And I will say the insect life around this plant is really off the hook, not just the monarchs, but all kinds of butterflies, bees, wasps, beetles. It is just a real hub. Rattlesnake master, another very distinctive. You want to talk about a plant that gives us a strong sense of locale. This crazy looking, almost desert-like plant was once thought to be an effective antidote to rattlesnake bite, which I don't think is true, but its prickly leaves and flowers protect it from hungry mammals. And it combines really well with echinacea, purple coneflower. They bloom at the same time and they just look terrific together. Echinacea, also a keystone plant for native bees. This iconic Midwestern plant occupies woodland edges. It thrives on disturbed soil. Like other of these opportunistic plants, it doesn't necessarily live a long time. It seeds around readily without being thuggish, and of course provides great winter value, seeds for birds in the winter time, and the way that the seed heads catch the snow is really quite fetching. Anise hyssop. This is a personal favorite of mine, another absolute bee magnet. So many different kinds of bees, especially bumblebees, I see humming around this plant in July and August especially, and it is very delicious. Especially the younger tender leaves and the flowers have a really nice fragrant anise flavor. It's a member of the mint family. Black-eyed Susan, another totally iconic Midwestern plant. This is one of many species of Rudbeckia. This one, it really blooms late summer into fall. Mounding plant, plays well with others. Classic, cheerful. I don't think a native garden is really complete without it. And, you know, another advantage of that, it's nice to have things that people recognize. Some of these plants are really unusual, but I think it's also helpful to have plants that people do recognize. That kind of gives them a little place to find their home in a garden while they get used to some of these maybe more unusual flowers. Blazing star. So there are many species of Liatris. Many of them are kind of marshy, want more moist soil. This one really can take very dry soil. The purple spikes are a really impressive accent. Aromatic asters. So you want to talk about keystone plants. Asters are a keystone plant for sure. There are quite a few species of asters that are very aggressive. They get really big. And so sometimes it's hard to find a place for asters in a really small city garden. This is one of the smaller and less aggressive species. Something else to keep in mind with asters, in say June, you can chop them in half, and that may prevent them from becoming quite as leggy and sprawling, and they'll be kind of nice and bushy. You know, I've been hearing a lot of people just in the last week talk about planting asters instead of mums. And I just think it's a great idea. They have, right, the similar fall richness and kind of a nice scrubby, sturdy quality, but they're perennials and unlike mums, so they're going to come back every year and they are going to provide really, really valuable pollinator support for late season insects. Okay, ground covers. We'll start with grasses. So prairie dropseed is kind of the queen of the matrix planting, right? This has taken over the gardening world with its key role in a matrix. There's a lot of matrix gardens that are just prairie drop seed, a carpet of prairie drop seed dotted with other plants. It's smaller. It's the smallest and really the least rambunctious of the prairie grasses, which makes it really great for an urban garden. And it doesn't spread around. The plants get bigger and wider, but they don't really spread too much. Side oats grama, Bouteloua curtipendula. So this, I think, is maybe better used as an accent plant, but what a show. More vase-like, and these lovely little dangling seed heads on an angle like that are really, really striking and make a very dramatic focal point. So most prairie grasses are warm season grasses. And so part of what that means is that they don't really green up until like June. And so early in the spring, April and May, you're dying for some green. And the prairie dropseed, the side oats grama, little blue stem, they are not there for you yet. And if they're at the edge of a garden, you're going to have kind of a brown hole, and it's maybe a little bit sad. So there are a couple of cool season, so tufted hairgrass is a cool season grass. This is really going to start greening up earlier. It's got a beautiful round shape, and as you can see later in the summer, it has these wispy, airy seed heads that are really, really striking. We think of sedges as shade garden plants, but the plains oval sedge, Carex brevior, really does great in full sun, very dry soil. It's actually perfect for prairie gardens. And like the tufted hairgrass, it's going to green up earlier in the spring, so it makes a nice border. It has very sweet little flowers in April and May. Not a grass, but a kind of a new favorite of mine as a ground cover and as a matrix plant is Euchera richardsonii. You know, we tend to think of Euchera, of coral bells, as shade plants. This one is a prairie plant. The flowers are not super showy, but it can take full sun. It can take really dry soil. And then after the flowers are gone, you still have these lovely fluffy mounds that just make a, you know, like a mound of this Euchera next to, say, a mound of prairie dropseed. You have great, like, similarity of plant shape, but contrasting leaf texture. Okay, now we are going to talk about some shade-loving plants of woodland edges. As city dwellers, we have a lot of shade from buildings and from parkway trees. Rather than fight it, let's use the opportunity to create woodland shade gardens. These plants provide a calming, cooling influence that is going to become more and more desirable, and I would say essential as our cities get hotter. Okay, witch hazel is also just kind of an unbeatable small tree. It can grow in shade. It's an understory tree, but it can grow in full sun. It can grow in shade. It's adaptable to well-drained topsoil. It can live in clay. Last tree to bloom in the fall. It's got these crazy little strappy flowers and these cool exploding seed capsules. Smooth hydrangea. Definitely make the argument that there might be an overabundance of hydrangeas in the garden. And there's so many highly cultivated varieties that it can be easy to forget that smooth hydrangea is in fact a Midwestern native. The Annabelle hydrangea actually was a naturally occurring variation found in Illinois. You know, what we see in the straight species is more of this lace cap type flower, which has only a few of these large, sterile outer flowers and a greater abundance of the true fertile flowers underneath. It's not that easy, for me anyway, around here to find the straight species of smooth hydrangea. But I am always looking for it and asking for it. And the more we ask, the more likely the nurseries are to sell it. Okay, buttonbush. This is another just crazy little native plant. These flowers, I mean, that sphere is basically just a pincushion full of, you know, dozens and dozens of tiny little flowers. You can see that little bumblebee in the front photo making its way around. And this is a plant where I'm happy that there are smaller cultivars, because the straight species can be pretty big, but something like sugar shack is only like 3 to 4 feet high and wide. You know, you see this a lot on, say, the side of a creek or a river. And I think it prefers moist soil, but I think it can do okay in medium garden soil. Snowberry. So this is not really your specimen plant for the front of the garden, because it's really is thicket forming, but makes a great backdrop. And these arching branches become loaded with these heavy white berries right around now. They look like jewelry, honestly. And they have very cute little flowers in the early part of the summer. They're very pink. They're kind of inconspicuous. But if you've got a little room at the back of a garden, I definitely recommend snowberry. Okay, we do not have a lot of broadleaf evergreens that are native to the Midwest. Ilex glaber is one of them, inkberry holly. This is really starting to be promoted by some garden centers as an alternative to boxwood. For one thing, it's native, and also importantly, it is not susceptible to boxwood blight. In my opinion, it is much prettier than boxwood. The leaves are more consistent size. They're very glossy. They're a little bit longer, alternate leaf. They have these pretty flowers in the summer. You do need a male holly in order to get berries. Now, I will say, it is almost impossible to find a male flower. I have yet to find a straight species available anywhere. There are some smaller cultivars like Shamrock or Gembox, which are female. And I know from my reading that there are 1 or 2 male cultivars out there, but I have yet to find one for sale. So if you know where to get one, let me know. But even without the berries, I think it's really a beautiful plant. Okay, now we're going to talk about seasonal interest plants for shade. Of course, at the beginning of spring, we have Virginia bluebells. This is just a favorite, very commonly seen in gardens, which is wonderful. Makes these low-growing colonies, which will spread by seed. They are ephemerals, right? So the leaves will go dormant in the summer, so don't expect this to maintained as a ground cover, but it is just a tremendous morale booster. You know, we plant a lot with bulbs, because we're looking for flowers that bloom really early, and Virginia bluebells are a native plant that will perform that same function in the garden. Wild geranium. This is also somewhat colony forming. I wouldn't call it thuggish, but it does form a lovely carpet. These flowers are really profuse and delicate. The leaves are very attractive, and they develop this really nice rusty fall color. So it really, this and a lot of these other spring woodland flowers, after the flowers go away, they really make a nice loose ground cover also. This is definitely true of columbine. This is a plant that I never get tired of. It looks very delicate, but it's super tough. I see it growing out of sidewalk cracks. And after the flowers have done blooming, I will often just cut the tough seeds off, and then you still have this loose mounding foliage. This seeds around readily. It loves open soil, but it's really not aggressive. It'll take a step back if another plant really needs to make its way. Phlox, woodland phlox, another of these spring flowers, makes a nice companion for the geranium. Like the geranium, will really thrive in rich, humusy soil. The leaves are slightly evergreen, which is really nice. Jacob's ladder, another really interesting texture, also kind of a waxy leaf shape. I mean, really, when you're dealing with shade gardens, you want to think about a lot of variety of texture in the forest floor. Because for a lot of the summer, the leaves are really all you have. This is one summer blooming woodland plant. This blooms in June and September. It's actually the only one on the list. We have a lot of flowers in the spring, we have flowers in the fall, and so in the summer, we have a lot of really interesting leaf texture along the ground plane. And this black cohosh is great for a little bit in the background because these flower spikes look like they're floating in the air. The star of the woodland shade garden in fall, as far as I'm concerned, is the white wood aster. This is smaller, definitely less aggressive than some of these sun-loving asters, and it is super twinkly and starry and beautiful. Goldenrod, another keystone plant that is very important, just like asters. Also, as you know, it can be quite aggressive. Blue stem goldenrod is less aggressive than others, especially Canada goldenrod, which I would definitely avoid. Okay, now the ground plane. So we have really sedges have just taken the gardening world by storm. Carex pennsylvanica, the sedge that started it all. If you haven't seen the Mount Cuba study on sedges that was published this year, I really recommend you check it out. They've done trials of, I don't know, 70 some species of sedges and rated them for their performance in various garden settings. Another wonderful sedge for the garden is Carex albicans, which is a little bit more adaptable, actually. I think it can take more sun, it can take drier soil. I really like to use it. I have a lot of conditions where I have like really heavy clay, for example. And so this is not always as available as Carex pennsylvanica, but it is becoming more available. And again, the more we ask for it, the more we'll be able to find it. Wild ginger, very distinctive. This lovely fluttering carpet on the ground plane has these little red flowers that you can really only see if you're down on your knees. They're pollinated by beetles. There are, of course, many species of ferns. I am partial to the Christmas fern because I really love the leaf shape. The leaves are kind of evergreen, semi-evergreen, and is really adaptable for many different conditions. So that's my list. We could go on for hours, but I know our hour, we have 1 hour, and it's almost over. So I think this is a good start. I'd love to know what some of your favorite plants are for native plants are for urban gardens, and I'd be happy to take questions. And by the way, I cannot see. I might have to stop sharing.
No worries if you want to go ahead and stop sharing and come back and join us in this little virtual land together, Angela.
Okay, great.
Judy, feel free to come off mute and hit us with your question.
It's actually not a question, it's a comment. just about all of these plants that Angela mentioned are native in the Northeast. And I'm a professional gardener, and I use some of them for my clients and for myself, lots of natives. So I'm thrilled. So thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. I am thrilled too. I actually had a client that I worked in Virginia with a couple of years ago, and I was really pleased to see. So that was, I spent some time studying the Eastern plants, and I was really pleased to see how many of them are native. So that is really great to hear.
Yeah, and I'm up near the Boston area. So
Okay, fantastic.
yeah. So this was great. Thank you.
Sure. And just by the way, for some reason, I am unable to stop sharing. I don't know if
No
the
problem,
host.
Angela. I went ahead and removed your sharing presentation, so it's just us now.
Okay, that's fine. I still can't see the Zoom window, so just know that I can't
Are
see
you
anything, but I can hear you, and I'll still
open
happily
your
answer the question.
Safari, Angela?
Yeah, I for some reason cannot do that.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, any other questions, anybody? All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions, but if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to contact ELA staff at any of our first names at ecolandscaping.org. So you have my name, Aviva, at Ecolandscaping, Catherine at Ecolandscaping, Susan, Mads, etc.
I'm so sorry. I did have a quick question. I couldn't get
go
unmuted.
ahead.
I'm not used to this platform. So you had the last slide kind of went down really fast. And it was the book recommendations.
Oh yeah, that's great. You know what? Can I share again? And I would be happy to show that to you because
Might need to refresh to do that.
So oddly, like I cannot. Oh, let's see. I am like
What we can also do, Angela, is you can send that list to ELA staff and we can send it to the attendees.
I will do that. And I will just tell you, I will just read aloud to you the titles, even if you can't see them. I mean, there are a lot of great books, but four that I have found really indispensable in my own work are: one, Planting in a Post-Wild World by Claudia West and Thomas Rainier; Prairie Up by Benjamin Vogt, just out this year. Super, super practical. The No Maintenance Perennial Garden by Roy Diblick. That's No, K-N-O-W. Roy is not focusing exclusively on the use of native plants, but he is talking about creating plant communities by grouping plants that have compatible growth rate and habit. And it's also very practical, wonderful, wonderful book. And then New Naturalism by Kelly Norris, who also talks a lot about different kinds of plant communities, lots of great lists of, plants that work well in various kinds of conditions. So I highly recommend any of those books.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great, and we'll just pause for a 20-second count just to see if there's any other questions that might come in while people are fiddling with their computers.
Hello?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Do you find the blue star to be kind of out of control? Because mine just keeps popping up in all sorts of places.
Really?
Yeah.
So you have it reseeding a lot?
Yes.
Huh.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's really good to know. I have not been working with it for that many years, so I have not yet experienced that. But I take that as a very good point of input.
I mean, it's beautiful, and it gets big, right? It gets wide, so it can take up quite a bit of space.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, I do see it around in Chicago a lot in gardens, but I see it usually in like fairly contained settings. So I wonder if, there might be some situations that are just more fertile ground for that kind of thing than others.
Maybe. I was
Yeah.
just curious if it was just
Yeah.
me or, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's great to know.
Oh,
Thank
and the other question is, I think I read with the black chokeberry, the reasons why the berries stay much longer in the season is they're not favored by the birds.
Yeah, I heard
Because,
that also.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I can believe it because
Right.
they are a little hard to get down. I
right,
mean, yeah, yeah. But in a
Right.
pinch, they'll eat them
sure,
when they get
sure,
hungry enough.
right. Thank you.
They're,
All right, holding for any other questions. Please feel free to interrupt freely, anybody who's still here. But while people are unmuting themselves, the link to today's evaluation is in the chat currently. Everybody who fills it out is another person who's helping us to continually improve and raise that bar on the virtual webinar experience. So please make sure it takes less than 2 minutes for you to fill out. And if you do that, it makes this better and better for everybody every time. Any further questions?
thank you so much for having me.
I do have one more. Do
Oh,
you find anise hyssop does the same thing, that the seeds with all of the
Oh,
bees
yeah.
and whatever?
So it
Yeah,
seeds around like crazy.
right,
However, I mean, really everywhere. However,
Right.
it's also very easy to pull up. So I don't
Right.
consider it like thuggish in the way that some other things are. And because I personally love it so much, I never mind it, popping up. But that is, yeah, it shows up all over the place.
right, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. But only really in open space, kind of like the columbine, I would say.
Hi, Angela. I have a question. Can you hear me? This
Yes.
is Jane.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I have used Black-Eyed Susan, a couple different types, different cultivars, and I've found that some of them seem like they get a fungus that sort of kills them off. Have you run into that problem? Is it with a certain species of Black-Eyed Susan or?
So, I mean, I've definitely seen like mildew, which
Mhm.
in my experience has not killed them off, but I know, I do know that other people have reported, I hear other people talk about that. I don't personally have experience with it, and something that I am really trying to master, like as we speak, is like all the different species of Black-Eyed Susan. There's so many of them. And so, sometimes I try this one and sometimes I try this one. But I'm afraid I couldn't
The one that I've had
say
the most
which-
success with is I think it's the thin leaves. I don't know what the botanical name is for it, but that one is kind of looks like a woodland type or whatever, and that
Mhm,
never seems to have any problems.
mhm,
I just wondered or if any others,
mhm.
any others on the call have any comments, would love it. But thank you. The presentation was fantastic.
Oh, wonderful.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Uh-huh.
And thank you all for your fantastic questions. And I have to join the chorus when I say thank you, Angela. Sarah, go ahead and come off mute.
I have some elderberries that are enormous. They're like they're at least 10 feet tall. Is there some way to control them from being that high? I mean, I have a friend who has them. They look like a bush.
I mean, I'm sure that the conditions will affect how tall it gets, but you can cut it like all the way down to the ground. And that will, probably slow it somewhat. I mean, it'll still grow back, but you can prune with abandon, I would say. So if it's too tall, just try and cut it down to the size that you want, or cut it all the way down to the ground in the spring, and it'll still grow back to a flowering size in the summer. And you really, it is tough. It's not gonna be injured by that.
Okay. I do cut it down every year down to the
Oh, you
ground.
do?
I do.
Oh, okay.
and it
Okay.
still comes.
I mean, to
Back.
me, 11 feet, like I understand it as a plant that could be like 7 to 12 feet. So to me, that sounds like that's kind of to be expected. So
Okay.
if that really is too big, then maybe it's just not the right plant for that spot.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Great.
Mhm.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you.
All right, and so that has taken us right about up to our time, and it is getting into those fall cozy weathers. I'm so very jealous of your outfit, Angela. I'm
Yeah.
sure it seems
Today is
very
the first
chilly
day
where you
I
are.
had to put on my wrist warmers. It is that
I'm
cold.
so excited for you. So everybody have a happy fall, and may your outfits be as lovely and your plants and harvests be plentiful. Thank you for coming out today, Angela, and everybody who is here to listen and engage. We could not do any of this without you. Again, please check out the webinar link in the chat, and I hope to see you all soon in our next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.